Good morning, afternoon, everybody. Afternoon, sorry. All the people jumping the shark before noon, but it is now officially 12 o'clock and it is afternoon. Welcome to day 3 of the Virtual Insurance Conference. And again, we are thrilled that so many of you guys are able to join us. And on behalf of NHF, welcome to Payer Trends and Cost Containment Strategy, what you need to know. My name is Marla Feinstein. I'm the Senior Healthcare and Policy Analyst here at NHF. And before we dive into the session, I would like to thank our generous sponsors for this conference: CSL, Genentech, Grifols, Hemophilia Alliance, Novo Nordisk, Pfizer, Sanofi Genzyme, and Takeda. At this time, I would like to introduce Jim Kenney, and he will talk to you about all the payer strategies and what you need to know. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Jim.
Thank you very much, Marla. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are today in the U.S. I know it's cold in the Boston market today, but we did get snow like they did in Minneapolis, so we're not complaining. A little cold and rainy, but we can take it. So I'm going to go through some general payer trends and issues as it relates to cost containment in the hemophilia space, as well as some issues around prior authorizations, appeals, denials, things like that. So with that, I just want to set the background. So why all the excitement, why all the interest in hemophilia as a class and really a category is, this is sort of obligatory slides, right? When we look at the specialty space, if you will, and the growth, and clearly it outpaces traditional. And I know that ESI was one of those PBMs that was always predicting we'd hit a 50% specialty spend by 2020, and we pretty much have made it. And you look at this data and you can see that the orange bar represents specialty spending and the lighter line at the top represents specialty growth, which you can see here. But clearly a major concern for plans today, trying to manage. And this is some data from IQVIA. If we look at the specialty medicine spending and growth, this breaks it down by category, and you can see the hemophilia is at 3% over here on the left on the graph, and its contribution to growth is 4% over here, and the expected amount of spend is still only around 3%. So the argument would be, well, if it's only 3% of specialty, why is it that everybody puts so much attention on this? And this is the reason, really. It's the prevalence and the resource utilization. And this is data from Sun Life's stop loss claims report. So the number 10 stop loss claim item, if you will, on their annual ranks is hemophilia, with an average stop loss claim of $464,000. So when you look at that, I mean, that's significant. And 92% of that number is factor or drug or product, if you will. So that's the reason we spend so much attention on this, and it generates a lot of concerns. And again, it's not surprising to this audience, but it kind of puts it into perspective. Whereas, if you have an orphan disease with maybe, 1 or 2 patients in a plan, may not be as much concern around it, but clearly, these patients can become quite costly and quite complex. And I think the range for their stop loss got as high as 4.5 million for one case. So quite significant. And then the landscape scares the heck out of us from the payer side. Look at all these products we have that are potentially coming in the 2020 to 2023 time frame. And that's, those that are in the shaded at the bottom of the slide are the ones that are potentially coming. And then for hemophilia B, again, we've got others coming there as well. So the landscape itself is constantly changing. And you can see in the graphics here, the growth in product, if you will. If we look back at 2014 versus, 2019, we've got, 6 additional products that have popped up here potentially. So again, a category with lots of cost associated with it, lots of new products. And plans struggle trying to figure out, how do we navigate this marketplace, and how do we get the right patient on the right product, but also manage these things in a cost-effective way from the plan's perspective. And we also have a fiduciary responsibility to the employers that we serve, and there's a lot of pushback from employers as well. When they see a $1 million claimant or a $2 million claimant, they want to know, what are we doing as a plan to effectively manage that, and are we doing a good job? And of course, they use benefit consultants that comb through the claims and come back to us and say, why didn't you do this or that with that particular patient or claim? So there's a lot of pressure as well. And we don't manage the category because we're worried about somebody complaining or scrutinizing our programs, but we manage it to try to make sure that we're getting good value in return for the dollars that we're spending. So the current trends in managing specialty costs fall into 3 buckets: the core benefit design, the formulary and clinical policy, and then innovative contracting. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about innovative contracting today. That wasn't really the intent. I do have a slide at the end just to highlight it. I do have a lot of experience there, but it wasn't really designed to be a contracting program, but it is a way of managing specialty drug costs. So if we look at the scope and capabilities of utilization management, it does differ based on the medical benefit under which the product is covered. So we have medical benefit products, which essentially require extra effort. There's a lot of retroactive claims payment. And these are basically products that are administered by a provider and are designated as covered under the medical benefit. To the right, we have the pharmacy benefit, where we have automated utilization management, real-time claims adjudication, and these are products that are self-administered. Now, hemophilia and the factor products are kind of tricky, right? Some plans may cover them under the medical benefit, some may cover them under pharmacy. So the strict definition that I just gave may not be perfect, but the general rule is if a product is physician administered, it's medical, and if it's not, it's pharmacy. So that's just something to keep in mind. So when we look at this space, and really any category of drug that we deal with today, the insurance product makes a difference. Do we have a commercial plan with medical and pharmacy benefit? Has the pharmacy benefit been carved out, which generates a lot of frustration for our participants, I'm sure, where you have a plan with a standard benefit design and a pharmacy program, and yet a particular individual has signed in through a self-insured employer, and their pharmacy benefit's been carved out to CVS or ESI or someone else. So now you're looking at the plan's website, you're looking at the plan's policies, and you're saying, gee, it seems like they cover Advaid in this particular arrangement, and all of a sudden you've got a patient who's getting pushback because Advaid for some reason is not covered the way you anticipated. Well, that's because it was carved out. And historically, when I worked at my plan, whenever I got a question from a manufacturer that said, hey, we've got a patient of yours who can't get access to this drug, my first answer would be probably a pharmacy carve-out. And invariably, that was the answer. They had carved out to a third party. Now, that doesn't make your job easier, but it requires a little bit more investigation around that individual patient and what their insurance plan is and where their benefit sits, and then getting to the right administrator of that benefit, if you will. And unfortunately, the plans typically can't help in that situation because they don't have access to that. They simply manage the medical side of the benefit for that patient, and the pharmacy is carved out to a third party. Medicare Advantage, certainly the Part D programs there that are fully integrated is medical and pharmacy. Pretty straightforward there. Actually, with the Medicare Standalone Prescription Drug Plan, or PDP, that is a pharmacy-only benefit. We've got Medicaid that's fee-for-service. We've got Medicaid that's managed. And, of course, the health insurance exchanges. So the insurance product can make a difference in terms of how a product is covered, what rules and regulations apply, as well as what legislative or statutory restrictions may or may not be in place on a particular product or a category of product. So let's talk just for a moment on the insurance coverage side of the equation. So we have fully insured business, which simply means that the employer is paying a premium per member per month for their employees, and it's basically financing all the costs associated with their members, their employees. The plan bears the risk. Any savings would flow to the plan. Generally, small to mid-size employers, rebates and discounts also flow to the plan. And the financial incentives typically are driven by the plan objectives. Now, keep in mind, we still have to do a good job of managing, because if we don't, then our premiums are going to be higher. And if we try to bid and compete with other insurers in the marketplace, we may struggle retaining that business. If the expectation for us is to, keep premiums low and not have significant increases year over year, if we're not doing a good job of managing the overall categories of diseases and drugs, we're going to lose that business. So although the incentives are driven by the plan, we still have an obligation to do what we can to manage all drugs, all categories as efficiently as possible. The self-insured consideration is a little bit different. It's essentially paid claims financing. Sometimes this is referred to as administrative services only business, or ASO. These are large employers because they need to take on risk in order to engage in a self-insured arrangement. Any rebates or discounts would flow back to them. There are a number of active third-party claims audits. So that's going to be your Mercers or Towers Watsons or what have you, maybe working directly with some of these clients. And as I had mentioned earlier, they're auditing this situation, auditing these claims. We had a situation years ago where we had an employer had two boys with hemophilia, and the claims expense was quite high. And we actually had negotiated some better rates with a specific specialty pharmacy, and we were unable to convince the patient to switch because they were self-insured, and the self-insured employer was a little bit hesitant as well. But ultimately, it was their claims, their responsibility to say to the employee, gee, we'd like you to use this alternative distribution source because there's some additional savings here. So, and again, that type of information does come up in some of these audits. There's some interest in formulary management, although in general, the plan has to maintain control over that, because we're managing the formulary based on all products, all information, all financing, and not just a single interest from one individual employer who may have an employee or a patient with a specific interest that's not in line with what the plan has done based on the total population that we're serving. Self-insured employers are not required to provide state-mandated benefits, but generally speaking, they do. Massachusetts, for example, has an infertility mandate, and we find that all the self-insureds typically cover infertility as well, because it is a benefit that's of interest to the employees. And if you're not covering some of those state-mandated benefits, you may have difficulty retaining and recruiting staff for your organization. So again, just to be clear, just to set the stage, there are some differences here in terms of the groups and pressures on the plan. And here, obviously, there's a lot more pressure to make sure we're managing and monitoring the claims as tightly as possible, since they are paying 100% of the claims cost as these claims come in. So who manages the benefits? No surprises here. Pharmacy benefit management companies certainly are the primary managers of the pharmacy benefit that we see, and we see the lead ones here with Express, CVS, Optum, and others, and the leading managed care organizations. And again, this is based on pharmacy lives, also managed pharmacy and medical. Rarely does the PBM manage any kind of medical benefit. They're typically managing only pharmacy, and generally speaking, the health plan is going to manage medical. And in a lot of cases where you have integrated systems like a Aetna or a Cigna, they're going to manage both medical and pharmacy. That was the case at my former plan as well. We managed everything internally, and that makes for a more comprehensive and cohesive program, if you will, and actually drives better outcomes. There's a lot of data in the literature which will show that if you carve out pharmacy, it actually costs more money, because now you've got a disintegrated system. Whereas if you have both benefits carved in and managed under one large umbrella at the plan, you tend to get better results and better clinical outcomes. So level 7 pharmacy benefit, a patient gets product through 3 channels: retail, mail, or specialty. For hemophilia products, typically plans are going to engage and negotiate with individual specialty pharmacies. These claims come in online to a PBM most often. Some plans do operate their own claim system, but the vast majority do use a PBM to process the claims. We have NDC, or national drug codes, attached to the products. The health plan pays for the medication. If it's premium-based, as I mentioned, the health plan's at risk. If it's self-insured, that employer is at risk. And the patients typically pay a flat copay or a coinsurance under the pharmacy benefit. Deductibles can apply, and deductibles have to be met on an annual basis for those patients who do have that. And that deductible can be pharmacy and medical combined. They could be separate, pharmacy and medical. But it also creates challenges, in particular, especially at the first of the year, when those deductibles have been reset to zero, and you have to reapply your expenses to that in order to be eligible for the copay or coinsurance once you've satisfied the deductible. And I know in Medicare is a great example, the Medicare Part D program, every January 1, when that first claims comes in, we would get a lot of calls into customer service from Medicare members saying, why am I paying so much money for my claims? I was just paying a copay, last month. They have to be reminded that, well, you have a deductible to start the year off that has to be met. And we have excellent reporting capabilities, which was referred to in that earlier slide, comparing medical to pharmacy. On the medical benefit side, it requires medical professional administration. These products can be provided in multiple settings: physician office, outpatient, inpatient, hospital clinic, home infusion, lots of options here. Typically, the physician of the facility buys the drug, bills the claims. They could source it from a specialty pharmacy. This is sometimes referred to as white bagging, which simply means that the specialty pharmacy ships the product to the provider, and the provider administers the product. Now, if it is sourced from a specialty pharmacy, that could generate a pharmacy claim and run through the pharmacy system, or the specialty pharmacy bills the health plan through the medical benefit, or the physician, and then the physician bills the health plans. The billing side can be handled a number of different ways, but that's what white bagging refers to. There are standard forms. They're generally electronic. The CMS 1500 form, you have to apply a J code for a drug and a CPT code for the administration, NDC codes are often used on the medical claim system, but not always, and that's why there's some claims adjudication delays and lack of crisp and clean data like we see on the pharmacy side, where everything is driven by NDC down to the individual product, size, strength, form, etc. Medicare Part B, there is a standard 20% coinsurance for these types of products. Patient cost share can be variable, certainly depending on the plans for commercial. And there are challenging reporting capabilities. But again, most of your medical drugs are managed by medical policies. Formularies come into play, obviously, across the board. The two general splits are open and closed. We're seeing a lot of movement to closed formularies in the marketplace today. And all that does is it allows the plan to sort of recognize and identify new products, not cover them at launch, and have a chance to put some policies together before they open them up and add them to the formulary. But again, a closed formulary implies a product is not covered at launch. An open formulary implies it is covered at launch. That doesn't mean you can't have criteria required to get access, but there are some basic differences there. The formulary review process, there's really three buckets. You've got your clinical review, which looks at efficacy, safety, tolerability, things like that. There can be a qualitative piece to that, which could look at some distribution, how the product is administered, and then obviously the financial is an important piece. And we also see, in addition to the cost of the products themselves, any rebate contracting or outcomes contracting would also play into the formulary review process. Some plans do have a medical benefit formulary in addition to the standard pharmacy formulary. So that's something that may require some navigation on the part of providers in the marketplace. It is very important for us to track and monitor real world evidence post-launch of a drug. So when a drug launches to the market and we put it on formulary, we only have the data from the experienced clinical trials, but that real world evidence that we begin to collect over time can be very helpful at making sure that the drug is performing as expected in the real world. And to some extent, that's where outcomes contracts can come in. They can keep the manufacturer's feet to the fire to make sure that these products do deliver on the promise that comes out of their clinical trials. The formulary is a drug list, a preferred list, a catalog of drugs, basically covered by the prescription drug plan. This information has to be available to the patient in one way, shape, or form. It may be a document that they receive. It may be available on the website through a patient portal. And beneficiaries are subject to pay, full out of pocket for drugs that are not on the formulary. And there is a hierarchy of drugs, and it's typically determined by a pharmacy and therapeutics committee. I don't think any of this is that surprising to those of you on the line today, but nonetheless, just for consistency, the P&T committee is designed to identify products that have merit and should be covered, as well as placing them on specific tiers on the formulary. And that tier structure can look like this. This is a sample. Does vary by plan. Plans may have 3-tier, 4-tier, 5-tier, 6-tier. I've seen up to 10 tiers in some cases. Keep in mind, the more tiers you have, the more confusing it is for the patients, the providers, and the pharmacies. The pharmacies play a key role in helping patients and providers navigate plan benefits. So if we design a benefit that's so complex from a tiering structure, there's going to be a lot of challenges and a lot of frustration. And in fact, you may have difficulty retaining membership if your plan is just a little bit way outside the lines in terms of tiering. But most of your plans today are typically a 4-tier or a 5-tier design. Copays do vary by plan. Coinsurance may be required on some of the tiers. So there really isn't an easy answer. So if a provider says, I want to know, what my patients typically would pay for, this particular product, let's say it's a Novo 7, what's the out-of-pocket going to be for Novo 7 for a patient? They may not be an easy answer because you could have very, very different approaches to that coverage depending on what the employer chooses. And what we see here is that ultimately the plan sponsor does decide that the benefit formula. So they can't determine if they want the formulary open or closed. Some plans may not offer open formularies anymore, but an employer, if there is a choice, could choose that. They also decide on the number of tiers, the various costs and copays. So when you're negotiating with an employer on an annual basis or biannual basis on renewing their contract with a plan or insurance provider, and they say, well, what's our cost? Well, let's just say the cost is, it's $1,000 per member per month. So that's what you're paying for your insurance. And they say, well, that's too high. How do we lower it? Well, we could adjust the tier structure. We could adjust copays and coinsurance. And that's not just on pharmacy. That could be copays and coinsurance on office visits, ER visits, medical expenses, and so forth. So there's a lot of variability there. And that's why, to my previous comments, there isn't always a quick and easy answer as to where that product is going to fit on a tier and what the out-of-pocket might be. And of course, depending on where the patient is in their annual obligation of deductibles, if we've got a Medicare Part D member, are they in the coverage gap? Have they reached catastrophic? So there can be a lot of challenges in terms of trying to figure out what does that out-of-pocket look like. And unfortunately, for some patients, as I like to say, visits to the pharmacy may be a surprise every time, because as their benefit shuffles around and moves between different levels, there can be a real issue there. But nonetheless, that closed formulary will deny access to a product and require an override or a medical exception if a drug is not listed on that closed formulary. So let's take a look at selected utilization management strategies. Prior authorization, prior approval, and pre-certification. I like to say this is an opportunity for plans to aggravate providers, patients, and manufacturers all in one swoop. Not really our intent, unfortunately. Ultimately, that can be a real challenge here. And plans have a responsibility, in my view, to really make sure that these programs and services are well designed, are well documented, and at least the navigation portion is clear to the end users. But it is a result of an evidence-based decision by a health plan insurer or a healthcare service, basically on a treatment plan, prescription drugs, DME, that they are medically necessary. We may require pre-auth for certain services, and it's not a guarantee it'll ultimately be covered, but nonetheless, it establishes a process. And if a prior authorization is denied, an appeal for reconsideration can be filed. So there is a mechanism to request a review if an initial request is denied. In some cases, those denials can be very firmly enforced. So if we look, for example, when we had Helixate on the market and we had Advate and Helixate, they're virtually identical products. If a plan had chosen one or the other, they could try to hold the line pretty tightly on whether a patient was going to use one or the other. But clearly, if we've got different products, and we're trying to drive a product over another, there may be good reasons why a provider wants to push back on that, or a patient does, because they're not technically as interchangeable as the example I just gave. Step therapy, step edits, fail first policies. Basically, the plans have identified an algorithm for a specific course of treatment. They might require a patient to try a less expensive, an older drug, an unbranded drug, what have you. Keep in mind, this has to be clinically appropriate. We're not going to have a patient try a drug that doesn't really have good efficacy in a disease state. Clearly, that's not the intent here. But it may also be that the plan has identified across a spectrum of factor products, some that are less expensive than others, and they may try to promote and prefer those in an effort to keep costs down in a particular category. Quantity limits as well are pretty straightforward, and those are generally going to be standard quantity limits based on the label for the drug. Some plans may promote more restrictive quantity limits depending on the drug, the disease, or the category. And those are managed through the pharmacy dispensing process. So the objectives of prior auth is to control for inappropriate use, and that's really the lead core objective here, right? We don't want patients using drugs outside the label. We want to manage products by indication. It's a way to promote our preferred products and highlight those that might not be covered. You can have step therapy protocols built in to the prior authorization. They obviously are going to drive rebate contract performance if you're promoting drugs through the PA process that are preferred. And the tiers are preset by product and do not change if a PA is approved. And I want to be clear here as to what that represents. So let's suppose we have someone who, has a product that's not covered on a formulary. Well, the PA is going to move it to formulary, but typically that's going to be on the highest tier. Or if we have some restriction on a product that's on tier 5 and we ultimately approve a prior authorization request, it remains on tier 5. It doesn't move to tier 4. And if you think about that, we would have chaos and pandemonium if you could just file requests to get tier changes for drugs. Everybody would be requesting this across the board, and it would become unmanageable. So the tiering stays regardless of the outcome of a prior authorization approval. And ultimately, the goal is to reduce cost. And if we had no cost concerns at all, then we wouldn't necessarily need prior authorizations, although on occasion, there are prior authorizations used for qualitative purposes. But in general, it is a cost-driven process to try to manage a category. And again, control for that inappropriate use. So here's a sample prior auth that I pulled from a large plan, national plan. Basically, there was a pre-certification required. The plan considered all these factor VIII products. As long as the member had mild disease, an insufficient response to desmopressin, or a documented clinical reason for not using desmopressin, or the member had moderate to severe disease, the plan would cover it. And then there's generally reauthorization requirements as well. And you see here at the bottom, the plan considers continued treatment necessary as long as they meet the initial authorization criteria. And that's generally the same. So unless something remarkable has changed with the patient's condition, which you wouldn't expect in hemophilia. But it gets interesting going forward. If the patient gets a gene therapy at some point, then there's likely going to be language in here that says if they have a gene therapy, there may be some authorization concerns around continued factor usage. That's not to say it would be denied, but it creates a little bit of a challenge. And we've seen that in the gene therapy space in spinal muscular atrophy with Zolgensma and Spinraza and risdiplam. So for a patient who receives Zolgensma, which is the gene therapy for SMA, there is language in most of the prior auths that the plans have that says they would not be allowed to get Spinraza if they have a gene therapy, or vice versa. So it does require plans to kind of revisit these things, and we're going to have to figure out how we're going to manage these gene therapy products when and if they make it to the market. Standard criteria we're going to work through is basically 100% of the time you're going to see indication as required as part of the PA, duration, frequency, dose, concomitant therapies, lots of other things that can be standard criteria on the PA. And for the most part, these can be filled out electronically and must be filled out in advance in order for the patient to get access to the product. I want to differentiate between a prior authorization and an NDC block very quickly. The NDC block simply means the drug has not been added to the formulary, and therefore the NDC will not adjudicate through the PBM when a claim is filed. The difference here is with a prior authorization, the provider has a roadmap to follow on what's required to get this product covered. With an NDC block, that roadmap doesn't exist. So the provider has to write a freehand request to get coverage of a product that's on the closed formulary. All the other criteria would be the same. If it's denied, they can request an appeal and so forth. But there is a little bit of a difference. So you could argue that a prior approval is being requested, but it's different in that the prior approval is not a preordained listed algorithm that the provider can follow that makes it clear as to what's needed in order to make this work. Here's a note on a tough study that was done, published in Health Affairs, that looked across a number of decisions as far as how products were covered and what about the PA requirements. And we see here that in general, 52% of the time, plans were consistent with the FDA label, 9% less restrictive, 5% not covered, but 33% of the time more restrictive. So the takeaway here really is that plans essentially are going to start with a label as they develop their criteria and their restrictive coverage. And if they believe that they need to be a little bit more restrictive based on the clinical data, the trial data, the FDA approval process, they do have that capability. And again, that's going to be spelled out in the policy. But we see here that 64% of the time, most plans cover these products the same. 36% of the time, there were some differences. And again, that makes your work more difficult as you try to navigate these different plans and programs. But once you get it down for an individual plan, generally it's consistent across all the patients within that plan. Step edits are also unique by plan. The degree of aggressiveness varies by plan, may relate to a relationship with a manufacturer. Manufacturers sometimes will contract away step edits or some of the restrictions. The FDA approval process can also be a driver. If plans felt the FDA approval process was not as restrictive or not as compelling, they may put some step edits in. And again, the number of steps can vary anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4. And cross-benefit management's another issue that comes up a lot, and we see more and more of that today. And this is simply where you would require a medical drug before you could get a pharmacy one, or vice versa, pharmacy drug before a medical drug. Again, that could be part of that step process. The step is through a drug, but the drug is in another benefit. Requires a little more coordination. It's not as clean and crisp as when we're only living in the pharmacy space, but it can easily be done by plans today. So what the cross-benefit management does is it focuses on beneficial differences between agents. Again, we're looking at what we saw on the formulary slide: efficacy, safety, tolerability, financial differences, whether it's an injectable for an oral or an oral before an injectable. In a lot of cases, I like to say when manufacturers come up with an oral drug in an injectable space, they have the "if we build it, they will come" strategy, right? That, well, it's an oral, therefore it's going to be used. Plans are not averse to saying we're going to require an injectable first. There's nothing wrong with that, and we may certainly see that with the gene therapies when they come. Plans may be comfortable with some patients saying, we're comfortable with factor replacement. This patient we don't believe is a candidate for the gene therapy, given the cost differential. So again, those benefit issues, those decisions are going to be plan driven, and it's not always obvious that you would think, well, why wouldn't you just cover an oral drug? It's better for the patient. But some would argue that a monthly injectable that the provider administers guarantees adherence, where a daily oral may not. So there can be some adherence issues that come up. So why are medical policies created? We really want to manage issues related to appropriate use, and you're not going to get away from that in a presentation from me or my colleagues when we talk about utilization management. It's about appropriate use and avoiding inappropriate use and cost effectiveness. We get input from providers, health plan staff, PBMs can ring in, provider communities, advocacy groups, members. There's lots of input that comes into these policies. Priority is given based on several factors, including unmet need, the product class, any diagnostic requirements or additional clinical evidence. Medical necessity determination for a non-covered drug. When it's being reviewed for coverage under a plan, criteria would include an appropriate request from a physician, a confirmed diagnosis, the rationale for the request, and some type of supporting medical literature. All of that would be important criteria to be considered for a non-covered drug. And again, that supporting literature is important. Not a poster presentation, on 5 patients by, a physician from some, unknown medical society or, somewhere far across the globe, but really something that's going to be relevant. It could be manufacturer information. It could be a presentation at ASH or some, appropriate organization. May very well be enough supporting literature to make a determination of coverage. Prior author approvals, the key need is improved documentation. We need to validate the patient and the treatment request. We need to make sure that the patient is appropriate. There's certainly a need for electronic prioritization protocols to facilitate the process. And I know that I happen to be immediate past president of AMCP, and we focus a lot of attention on this PA process, and we're very supportive of the electronic prior authorization process because we believe that eliminates a lot of the frustration. We know that the vast majority of rejects that come in on prior authorizations are due to insufficient data being provided. So that's very important. The criteria must be fair and reasonable. We want to avoid certainly the risk of hospitalizing a patient unnecessarily or having them have a significant negative outcome or a disease event. So that's really an important driver here. So how do we expedite the process? Clearly, you need to know where your key contacts are going to be. If it's a fully integrated plan, medical and pharmacy, you're going to outreach to the plan. If the benefit has been carved out to specialty, they may facilitate the process, or PBM. And in a lot of cases, the PBM will adjudicate the prior auth process and or the specialty pharmacy. So that may be the first point of contact. Some strategies to improve success: file electronically wherever possible, make sure they're complete, and again, provide appropriate documentation. And there isn't necessarily a cheat sheet on what's right and wrong at each of the plans, but after a while, you get pretty good at this process. And if you get one that works for a patient, then replicating that for subsequent patients generally makes the process a little bit easier. But there's no question that a fully electronic system would make everybody's lives easier. Because clearly, when we go online and we're doing a purchase, if we don't get all the credit card information correct, it doesn't let us proceed. The same would be true with electronic PA, and it will eliminate all those rejects that occur just because we don't have accurate and complete documentation. The primary reason, as I mentioned, is insufficient information for a denial. So careful review of plan requirements can hopefully resolve that issue. But plan and benefit managers do have a responsibility to provide clear and clinically appropriate criteria to effectively match the patients and providers to the right product. So this is a call out to my colleagues to say, we do have a responsibility to get this right and set it up appropriately. And if it's not done, then shame on us as a group to not make that work in a more efficient fashion. So improving documentation in an appeal. The appeal requires additional documentation, certify why the patient needs access. They need to understand the insurance requirements. And again, specialty pharmacies can often assist in this process, particularly in the hemophilia space where there's a lot of experts out there. They may have an understanding of the plan, and they have an incentive, obviously, if they can help you expedite that. They can make a dispensing, which is not a bad thing for the specialty pharmacy, but they can also help you navigate the system. And they deal with all of the insurers typically, so not just one in particular, so they can be very helpful. The appeals are going to document a poor outcome, create that appeal letter, and here are some 4 key criteria that should go in that appeal. The patient case details, any limitations or problems with the current treatments, the benefits you anticipate with the new treatment, and any references from the medical literature. So some of this is repetitive from the other slides, but I'm kind of boiling it down into this is going to be the perfect appeal letter to get in, having the greatest success of approval upon submission. So what are some of the general strategies in hemophilia and other disease states? We want to pay less, and that can be with aggressive contracting or narrow networks. We want to manage more, prior authorization and step edits where appropriate. We want to shift responsibilities to the member to some extent in terms of copays and deductibles, but that there's a balance there, right? Because if we are so aggressive at shifting that and they can't afford the copays and deductibles, going to wind up in the ER and we're going to pay for it on the back end very, very significantly. We also want to transfer risk to providers. There's a lot of risk-based contracting going on and a lot of pay-for-performance programs. And again, what it's designed to is to get everybody engaged in the process to think, are there more cost-effective options here? And can we safely and accurately move to some of those choices? So it's not just pick the cheapest product and push everybody to that product. It's really balancing, efficacy, safety, tolerability, and cost, and patient needs and requirements to effectively manage the category. Some hemophilia specific trends, 90% of the payers do consider them in the specialty space, 40% manage them under pharmacy. So again, 60% manage under medical, so there is that difference. And there is a trend toward a lot more channel management using the specialty pharmacies, and we may see a shift in that 40-60 split in the not too distant future. The goals of specialty pharmacy are to ensure appropriate use by applying guidelines and criteria, as well as the plan-driven prior authorization and formulary programs, to improve clinical management by assessing adherence and persistency, patient care services, therapy, and case management, and ultimately demonstrating improved outcomes, because ultimately that's what we're all looking for. We want to optimize cost management via assay management, get the lowest unit cost from the dispensing HTCs, especially pharmacies, and receive any available rebates from manufacturers, which would only be done in exchange for our ability to move market share. If we're not moving market share, then rebates are not going to really be at play here. And manage site of care and promote factor dispensing through HTC 340B pharmacies or contracted specialty pharmacies. And this is some data from a pharmaceutical strategies group, Understanding Specialty Pharmacy Management survey that was done. And without question, we recognize the value of the HTCs and all the other services that they provide, and the reduction in risk and events in patients who participate through those programs and pharmacies. So they're a valuable tool in this process. Hemophilia therapies require a multifaceted approach. I don't have to tell the audience that. They certainly get that. But these are the core elements. We've got the dispensing piece, the utilization management piece, care coordination and contracting, all around this central theme of hemophilia therapy management. And the plan is trying to manage all the things on the outside of the box of the circle here, and the providers, the HTCs and so forth, are providing that hemophilia therapy management, if you will, on the inside here. As I promised, a quick slide on contracting here, kind of wrap up. Traditional contracting historically, as we see on the left here, was flat rebates, volume or share-based rebates. If we drive utilization, we drive rebates. What we're seeing today in the market, especially in this area of rare disease, specialty drugs, orphan disease, and certainly there's a lot of interest when we start talking about gene therapies, is value-based contracting. And the way the value-based contracts work is you're essentially contracting for a specific targeted outcome. And there's a lot of ways to structure these, but ultimately what you want is a guarantee from the manufacturer that you will get as good as or better results than was demonstrated in the clinical trials. And one of the challenges we have is we see a lot of products today that are approved in a rapid fashion. They get an accelerated approval, they get a breakthrough designation. There's 3 or 4 different designations from the FDA that are made for products that expedite the FDA approval process. And in some cases, these things don't require a great deal of clinical trial and experience before they come on the market. And so from a plan perspective, if we have a drug that comes out of phase 2, gets a conditional approval, the manufacturer is expected to still conduct phase 3 trial data or trials, but we're not going to know what those results are. So what we do is we create these contracts to say, all right, if this drug, and let's use gene therapy as a perfect example. So the promise of gene therapy is the patient will get treated and they will not require routine factor prophylaxis. Whether they require any factor use to be determined, but nonetheless, you could create a value or outcomes-based contract with a gene therapy manufacturer that says, after they receive it, we would not expect to have factor usage in excess of X number of times or any over the course of whatever the durability expectation is for the product as well, which is a second opportunity that you could employ in this type of a product and in a value-based arrangement. So we're going to want to make sure if a gene therapy is given that we have durability, right, that it lasts 5, 6, 10 years, whatever it is. And we know the durability is a question because of the nature of the way the gene therapies are delivered today. Given the turnover of cells in the liver and where the gene therapy exerts its effect, there is some questions in terms of durability that will have to be resolved, but they'll only be resolved over time. But the plan is putting their confidence in the company with a large multi-million-dollar expense up front, and is simply saying, we want some guarantee that 3 years down the road, the effect is not going to wear off, and now we've got a patient who got a $2 million gene therapy and is back on a factor prophylaxis or some other treatment that may be available in the space today. So again, that's the direction we're moving in for a lot of these newer agents, and you may also see that with some of these non-factor products that are coming to market, like Tutusaran and others, which are certainly very exciting for us, and this contract area is also very, very exciting, but something to pay attention to. And that may involve interacting with the HTCs, because if we need to collect data on a patient who got a gene therapy, we only have that one claim at time zero. We don't have any additional claims to look at. We don't have any additional authorizations to make. We don't have any additional requirements for that patient to interact with the health plan. We may need to make an arrangement with an HTC to say, can we capture this data at certain time points and somehow, with an arrangement through the patient and informed consent, share that information back with the plan so we can monitor how is the patient actually doing post-treatment with this gene therapy. So in summary, specialty drug trend is certainly a major concern for health plans and employer benefit managers. The benefit ultimately defines the coverage, and the employer has a lot to do about that. And the extent of utilization management and patient out-of-pocket cost is also driven by the benefit structure and the employer's choices. Documentation is key to prior authorization approvals. The PBM or the plan can direct the process, and the ultimate goal is to get positive outcomes in a cost-effective way.
What would you say the split between pharmacy and medical for factor is?
Yeah, the data I had on that slide, which was provided to me, was 60-40, but I do think it is increasing. My former plan, we were 100% specialty on the distribution side, right? If you were pharmacy related, but we had we were about 60-40 in the opposite direction. So we were about 60% specialty, 40%. But it can vary by plan. Some plans can be very aggressive and say, we're going to force all the claims to go through. I think obviously that's not what we're trying to do, because that takes the HTCs out of the process, and we know it's very important for the HTCs to dispense products. That is a driver of some of their finances, and they need to certainly make the case. And we did that in my former plan. We had a situation in our main market where I worked with the medical director, and we put a program in place that mandated every hemophilia patient actually sign up with an HTC and go through their systems. Because prior to that, we had patients scattered all over the state of Maine that weren't necessarily well managed, and some of them were multi-million-dollar patients. And we saw that as a very favorable opportunity. And then we also contracted with the 340B pharmacy for the HTC to make it required that the patients also get their product there as well.
Right. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because a comment in the chat came in that they were hopeful for the day that the insurance companies really learn the value that comprehensive HTCs provide, and instead of going through a specialty pharmacy outside of the center, and it's interesting that you bring up that there are ways, it's just a difference of approach between insurers. Correct?
Well, there's certainly a hope there, and I think part of it is, the HTCs are one of the best kept secrets out there, right? And you've got the CVS specialties of the world and some of the specialty pharmacy that are coming in, knocking on the door and offering millions of dollars worth of savings and so forth. And certainly the HTCs can offer significant savings as well. I think where the story gets very compelling is on the medical side, right? All the other
Right.
goods and services that come to play, that, even if you are paying, a modest premium for the factor, when you get all these other goods and services that ultimately save on the medical side of the fence, that's significant. But as I said earlier, even in the stop loss claims, 92% of it is factor.
Factor, yeah.
Get away from the cost of factor when you have these conversations. But it's really about promoting yourselves as an HTC and the benefits you provide. And really, if you can get into the medical directors sometimes and away from the pharmacy directors, you may have a little bit more success.
Excellent. And then from Ellen K, I found that while patients are generally locked into a plan for a year, the plans seem to be able to change formularies at their will. If that happens, what recourse do we have to an appeal?
That is unfortunate. Now, sometimes the plans change, sometimes the employer changes, and the patient is now with a different plan. I mean, there's always recourse to appeal and try to stay with the same product if a product is being denied. And in some cases, it's the practical reality of, is there really a true issue, a medical issue with a possible change of a product, or is it simply you're just comfortable, it's convenient, and you really don't want to make the change? And sometimes that's the issue. Now, we certainly get it. We didn't flip-flop products year over year. Some of the PBMs do. You look at the excluded drug list every year, and it's more common in, let's say, insulin, right? One year, it's Lantus, and the next year it's Tracebra, and the next year it's Basaglar, and so forth. They bounce back and forth. That's very disruptive to patients. Again, you could argue that they're relatively interchangeable. It is a little bit more tricky with the factor products, but I think the patient does get. I actually have I have it right here on the desk somewhere. I just got the new notice that says your plan is changing next year. Here's the formulary changes. If you do see something, that is sent out in advance. Typically, plans are required to do that at least 60 days in advance. That's when you need to get a little proactive. Engage the provider, reach out ahead of time, try to get that request process in advance if, in fact, there's going to be a challenge and a switch could be required. Some states prohibit that. State of Maine has some restrictions on switches, so sometimes that works in your favor. But you have to be proactive, and you shouldn't be surprised if you're following your benefit materials that do come out. Just says we're letting you know about formulary changes for 2021, and again, they list the card types. It's a whole comprehensive list, right? Here's the 2021 tier. It was 3, 4, 5. What plan you're in? So they have to provide that. I mean, that is something that plans are required to provide. If you're switching to a new plan, same challenge for the patient. You've got to look at the new plan documentation and look for your drug and look to see. And Medicare patients do the same thing when they go to the plan finder. Gee, is my drug covered on this new plan if I switch? Unfortunately, it's a bit of an investigative journey, but you do have some time because these materials typically come out in advance. It's not as though you're switching January 1 and you get a letter on December 31st and you don't have any recourse. But you do have to do some legwork up front, hopefully, if you want to stay with that product and can get that request approved.
Which leads very well into the next question, that a lot of people have seen a huge increase in the time from submitting a PA to the approval, right? And they are told that it's up to 72 hours for urgent approvals, and they're wondering how could they speed that up?
Yeah, it's always a question we get, and it's fascinating. I was on a panel with a colleague at AMCP, and there was a hemophilia nurse from Nevada who said it was like 30 days to get a PA approved on I forget even what the product was. And it wasn't a factor. It was like tranexamic acid or whatever it was. And we both looked at each other and were like, 30 days, that's nuts. Most plans have a 24-hour turnaround, and then it can be up to 72 hours for that resubmission. Again, if the data is not sufficient on that initial request, that's what adds some time in. So I think the most important thing is making sure that it's as accurate and complete as possible. And that at least allows that initial review to go through. And then each plan does have their own criteria. I think depending on what the product is and what the needs are, that sometimes can expedite that process. I know at our plan, it would come back to the clinical pharmacy team within that 24-hour window. If it was rejected, then they would review it and respond back. And then it could come back in for that second cycle around, and that's 72 hours. Sometimes things go a bit further. Unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer other than if it's as complete and thorough as possible, at least you're minimizing the number one reason why these things reject. And I'm trying to remember some statistics I saw, but I want to say it was like 60 or 70% of the time these things reject because the data isn't sufficient or the documentation isn't sufficient. I know that's easy to say, we'll just provide more data or do it correctly. But, each individual plan has their own policies. Keep in mind, plans are accredited by the National Committee on Quality Assurance. Most plans are, and they have very strict standards, and we are audited. So at least have the benefit of those 24 or 72-hour turnarounds that people do take seriously. So they don't typically, I'm guessing that Nevada plan was, wasn't accredited, so they didn't care. But I know that people would be running around the office in my plan saying, we got to get this appeal done because we're up against the window. Because when NCQA comes in and they pull those statistics, if you're taking 5-6 days, your accreditation status is going to be dramatically affected. Not to mention the fact that you need to turn these things over because there's a patient out there who needs a product and you need to make a decision on this expeditiously. Exactly.
And let me, so there was a lot of talk in the chat about insufficient information, like when a given center will submit what they feel is a strong argument, whether it's medical necessity, whether it's all the required elements that you laid out on the one slide, right? That still they're getting the bounce back to insufficient information, right? And what are the routes to sort of solve that preemptively?
So a couple ways to go. One is you get very good at creating cheat sheets, right? I used to joke about when you had a drug without a prior authorization, let's say, right? It's non-covered at all. And, docs they have to send in a generic letter saying, I want to use this. And they put some criteria in and they happen to put, left earlobe as the affected area, right? And then all of a sudden they talk to their colleagues and they say, hey, I put in left earlobe and it got approved. Right. So what happens is now all of a sudden there's an outbreak in left earlobe disease in the marketplace because everybody realizes that's the magic word to put in there. I think that's one way to do it. You can talk to colleagues at other facilities. Gee, I'm struggling with this appeal. Have you had any success? What am I missing here? Sometimes the manufacturers provide cheat sheets. The plans don't like that, but I've seen that where they actually hand the provider a template. Here's a template appeal process or appeal information that you could submit that likely is going to get approval. They do a lot of work. They're interacting with all of you out there in the marketplace, right? And they're saying, gee, this plan got denied, but this plan did not. Well, what was the difference? Well, they provided 3 months of assay management where the other plan provided, just one data point or something. So it could be something like that. You don't want to, overkill. But again, that's probably the best answer I can give you is, when you get a success, take a good copy of that, post it on the wall, right? Make it work that way. But talk to your colleagues because they're having the same problem. And the specialty pharmacy can be a great resource. I'm really struggling with Aetna or Cigna. I can't get this claim approved. Do you have any idea can you help me in any way? And again, they have an incentive, they're spending. Now, obviously, you're an HTC, and you're not wanting the specialty pharmacy to dispense, you can talk to the PBM as well, right? And hopefully a PBM that maybe doesn't have a specialty pharmacy arm that they're promoting if they're involved. So you can find somebody out there that may help you. And then again, there may be somebody at the plan in the clinical department who will take the time to give you a little bit more information. But that would be my recommendation.
Can you talk a little bit more about assay management strategies that insurers are using?
Yeah, so one of the things that insurers do is sometimes they have contracted requirements for assay management to make sure that the factor dispensed is within tolerance of what was requested. One of the things that the specialty pharmacies like to use to knock the HTCs is to say, well, we have vast reserves of factor and we can get the assay management down to within a certain percentage, of the requirements for the provider. And, if we need 900 units, we're going to get 900. You're not going to get 1,200. And we know that, MASAC allows a 10% window, if I'm not mistaken. Most of our contracts were 1%. We tried to keep that a lot tighter. I think what the HTCs need to do is to, work to, promote the fact that they also have the ability to very tightly manage that. And that does make a difference because if you're getting, 10% excess factor on a $20,000 claim, every month, that's $25,000 a year, $24,000 a year, an additional cost, a factor that arguably is not needed. So that's typically how that's used. Certainly assays are going to play a key role in the gene therapy space when we go there to see whether patients are responding and what their levels are, factor levels are. But I think the HTCs need to do a good job of promoting that they can meet more strict standards in terms of assay management and not simply have the provider rewrite the script, which is another argument that especially likes to throw at you. Well, if they write for 900 and they have 1,000, they're just going to say, Doc, can you rewrite the script for 1,000? And then there's no evidence that there was any missed opportunity. And I get it. And if that has to be done, it has to be done. We're not averse to paying extra. Also working with providers, and that's something that the HTC can do as well. If the provider writes for 950 and they've got 900, maybe the provider would be fine with 900. So they could actually, in the other direction, say, we saved you money because we were able to provide a less factor units for this particular patient, and it was perfectly acceptable to the provider. They did 950, we had 900. And it goes both ways, right? So I think that's another story where the HTCs can provide some additional savings to the plan in terms of assay management. It's not just hitting the target. It may be coming in a little bit below what was originally requested, because I can assure you that the specialty pharmacy is not going to come in below. They're going to hit that target or come in a little bit over. They're not in this to necessarily dispense less, but that would be a great opportunity as well for the HTCs.
And with that, we are at our time. Let's thank Jim for all of his time and his insights. It was an incredibly helpful and useful presentation. And I think our attendees really, really enjoyed all of it. So, and with that, I thank you again, Jim, for giving us your insight into this and how it works.
Thanks, Marla. Thanks for hosting. This was great. The platform was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I hope I helped the attendees in some way. And I'm a big supporter of HTC, so I wish you all the luck as we navigate this system today, and look forward to another opportunity to engage with you in the future.
Exactly. I think we signed you up for, I don't know, I think at this point I'll have to look at the chat, but it's maybe 8 or 9 webinars to all HTCs. I'm not sure, but we'll get back to you on that.
Well, in the virtual world, it's easy. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. And thanks again, Marla.
Bye. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.